On this episode of The Intentional Life, I'm going to share one thing that you should focus on if you want to build better habits, a surprising mark of a healthy church and a healthy Christian that might sound controversial, but according to the Bible, it's actually not. I'm going to look at a cultural analysis of how fathers impact their kids' grades in school. And then I'll give a book review of The Sin of Empathy by Joe Rigney and some takeaways I had from the book. Now, jumping into our intentionality corner, where we always start, I want to share with you something that you should do to build better habits, and then try to make it practical for you in your life and what this actually looks like. So here's the deal: when it comes to building better habits, it is much better to focus on what you want to achieve rather than what you want to avoid. Much better to focus on what you want to achieve rather than what you want to avoid. You see, it's much more fun to run towards something than to run away from something. So, for example, what sounds more motivating to you? Avoiding certain foods or getting in better shape in order to play with your kids on the floor? How about this? Restricting your time on social media or spending more focused time building a skill you actually enjoy? Or one more, not staying up so late or being fully rested every morning. You see, it is better to focus on making progress, not avoidance. Like of the options I gave, the first ones did not sound as good as the second options because the first options were about avoidance. The second options are about making progress. Now, yes, progress often includes avoidance, certainly, but avoidance isn't the goal for the sake of avoidance. A better future is actually the goal. Avoidance may help you get there, but that's not the goal in and of itself. And so, for example, if you want to have more energy to play with your kids on the floor in the evenings, that may mean eating less sugar. If you want to spend more time on things that matter, so it could be things like reading or doing things that bring you joy instead of anxiety, that may certainly mean restricting how much time you allow on social media for each day. But in both of these scenarios, there is a clearly defined reason for your behavior change. So yeah, I might want to spend less time on social media, or I might want to eat better, but it's not for the sake of eating better or spending less time on social media. It's for the sake of playing with my kids or doing something I actually enjoy. It isn't because you know it will make you feel better. It's because it will allow you to experience something you aren't currently experiencing. The focus is not just like, well, I just want to be better or feel better. The focus is, what is it that I actually want to do? So the first step is to define what you want. What is it you actually want? And then change what you will actually do. See, oftentimes the first step we think is, here's the things I got to change that I got to do. No, no, no. The first step is to figure out what you actually want. You see, it will always feel impossible to create a new long-term habit just for the sake of change, just for the sake of being healthier or whatever. That's going to feel hard. Decide rather what it is you actually want to achieve and let that dictate what you want to change in order to make it happen. In other words, what is it you actually want to achieve? So let me try to make this maybe a little bit more practical for you. Again, what you want to focus in on is what it is you actually want. Why is it you want to be healthy? Why is it you want more time? Is it to spend more time with your kids? Do you want to develop a skill? Don't focus then on working less or eating less bad stuff or avoiding distractions so you can work on the skill. That's not where you start. Instead, decide what you want to do and then plan something in your calendar or in your day that will allow you to do it. Because you will naturally spend less time on the bad stuff or avoid the bad stuff if you have actually planned to spend some time doing the good stuff or have a goal to achieve the good stuff. So, for example, if you want to read more, you should say, I want to read 30 minutes every weekday evening. Well, if you start doing that, like say after dinner, I'm going to read for 30 minutes every day, every weekday night after dinner, you will naturally spend less time on your phone because instead of just avoiding spending time on your phone, you've replaced it with something you actually want to do. Now, I'm not saying you can't eventually think through some of the restrictions or think through some of the things you want to avoid to hit your goals. Certainly, that is part of it at some point, but that's not where you start. That is not where you start. Again, this is why a lot of times new goals, New Year's resolutions don't get off track because we start focusing on, here's all the things I don't want to do. And then it's not fun. It's not encouraging. It just feels like torture. So another example, maybe you say, I want to get closer to God. And so you might think, well, in order for me to get closer to God, I got to stop going to the club, got to stop looking at porn, got to stop hanging out, spending so much time with bad influences on my life. Now, yes, those are great things that can certainly help you, but that is not where I would start. What I would start with, what are the positive changes I want to make? Maybe I'm going to start going to church on Sundays and commit to a local church community so I can figure out this Jesus thing, not just by myself, but with others who might have been doing it longer than me. I'm going to read my Bible one chapter every day. So for 5 minutes in the morning, every morning before I look at my phone. Like that's what I'm going to start doing before I stop doing other things. I want to focus first and foremost on what I want to do. And then some of the other things might naturally happen. And here's what's interesting too. Focusing on what you want might lead to surprising ways to accomplish your goal. So again, if you think, well, I just want to be healthier, so that means I should go to the gym 5 days a week. Okay, sure, that might be able to help. It's hard to start going 5 days a week if you're not going right now, but sure, you could do that. But if you said, no, I don't just like want to be healthier, like I want to spend more time, I want to have more energy to roll around the ground with my kids. Well, you might find that there are other things you could do that can make that possible for you besides just going to the gym 5 days a week. So focusing on what you want might lead to surprising ways to accomplish your goal. So here is the challenge. Here's a challenge. What is one positive? So not negative or avoidance. So when I mean by positive, what is something you want to do? But what I mean by negative is something you want to stop doing. That's not what we're going to focus on. What is one positive thing, positive change you can add to your calendar this week that will bring you closer to the type of person you want to be in that particular area? So before you start taking things off, I'm going to stop doing this. Focus instead on what is one thing I can add to my calendar this week? What is one positive addition I can make to help me be the type of person I want to be going forward? And again, as you add these positive things, you will naturally have less time and then eventually probably even less natural desire to do some of the things that you should be avoiding. Now, again, at some point in the future, you might want to be more intentional about the things you want to avoid or stop doing. That's fine, but that is not where you start. If you want to build a better habit, start with one positive change you can make to your life and focus on that before you start trying to focus on all the things you're trying to take off your plate. And when you do so, that will help you build better habits. Moving into our faith reflection, I want to share with you a mark of a healthy church and a healthy Christian. This does go against the assumed cultural belief of how we should view life and what we should do. I think to me, sometimes it's kind of funny to hear non-Christians say Christians should act like X, Y, or Z. And sometimes when I hear people talk about this, it becomes very apparent very quickly they haven't actually read the scriptures, because the Bible does not just say whatever American 2025 in America cultural context, that's how you should be a quote unquote good person. There's a lot of things that the scripture has to say that a 2025 secular American might be somewhat surprised to actually find. Again, our goal, if we want to be faithful, is to follow Jesus, not culture. And I'm going to share with that here. So in Titus chapter 1, Paul is writing, he's talking about healthy churches, elders, church governance, and how churches should govern themselves. And then he hits on a topic that, again, non-Christians might be surprised to find, but I would even say Christians might even can get this wrong if they're not careful, because we can be so influenced by our secular cultures that we don't let, the word, dictate our life. And so non-Christians might be surprised by this, but I think Christians can also get this wrong. So in Titus chapter 1, verses 10 and 11, Paul writes this: "For there are many rebellious people, full of empty talk and deception, especially those from the circumcision party." I'll explain that in a second. Verse 11, "It is necessary to silence them. They are ruining entire households by teaching what they shouldn't in order to get money dishonestly." So the context here is after the final qualification for elders that Paul gives in a couple of the verses leading up to this in Titus 1 for elders, that they are to be hold faithful to the message that is taught, so that these church leaders can encourage sound teaching and refute those who contradict it. We then see the problem. The problem, one of the reasons Paul is writing this letter, is that there are false teachers deceiving believers in Crete. So 1 Timothy is written to Timothy and the Christians on the island of Crete, and there are false teachers that have sprung up. And so Paul is trying to help these Christians not be deceived by these false Christians. Now, I do want to say this. One of the challenges with reading the New Testament letters is that we don't always exactly know the precise issue that the letters are addressing, or the exact reason why certain things are being written in these letters. Now, those reading, the original audience reading this letter for Paul, would certainly know what the issues are that Paul is referring to. We are not the original audience, and so what we do as Bible readers and scholars and historians, people who try to understand these things contextually, is that we have to piece together as best we can what is going on in this particular area without knowing precisely what's going on, and we piece together by knowing cultural context and by reading, okay, what is Paul actually saying in this letter to help us give us an idea of what is actually refuting. Now, that being said, here's what we can take from the letter. that there are false teachers who are linked to the circumcision party. Now, what is the circumcision party? You can read a lot about this in the book of Acts. You can read about this too in Paul's letter to the Galatians and the book of Galatians. And what we know from the circumcision party, at least how this language is used in other parts of the New Testament, is that these are likely people pushing Gentile Christians. So they could be Jewish Christians, or they could just be Jews who are not Christians. But they are pushing Gentile Christians, so non-Jewish Christians, to be circumcised, aka circumcision party, and also likely to pushing Gentile Christians to follow the Old Testament law. So things like the dietary food laws against circumcision, ritual purity, so certain sacrifices and things you would do in order to be made right for pure for temple worship. They're saying, hey, you got to do all these things to be in a good standing with God. Now, here's the problem. If that is true, that these Gentile Christians must also be circumcised and follow the food laws and do some of the other ritual things that you read about in the Old Testament, what that means is that Jesus' sacrifice wasn't enough. Now, obviously, the Christian take on this and what Jesus himself taught is that he is the once and for all final sacrifice, which means Jesus makes us clean. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time here. Maybe I'll do this on a future episode. Sometimes people falsely accuse Christians of picking and choosing, like what they follow in the Bible, and so they'll talk about, some of the Levitical laws, and they'll be like, "Well, you follow this, but then you do this, and so you're picking and choosing." I just want to briefly say that that's not actually what Christians are doing. What we're doing is we're actually reading the Bible coherently, and we're reading it the way that Jesus read it. And in the Old Testament, there are certain things like God's moral laws, His ethical laws, that do not change because right and wrong does not change. So human sexuality, how to treat one another, these are moral things that never change. However, there are certain things which are known as like the purification laws or the ritual laws, the ceremonial laws rather, in the Old Testament, that were for the ancient Israelites in order for them to be in a right standing to worship at the temple and the tabernacle. So there are things that you could do that make you ritually impure, that you would have to do sacrifices, or you'd have to do in order to be ritually pure again. Now, when Jesus comes, he is the once and for all final perfect sacrifice. And so that if you know Jesus, you are ritually pure. So therefore, things like circumcision, things like following the kosher food laws, things like certain sacrifices that were required in order to be, not because you did anything sinful, but things that you could have done that made you ritually impure. If you're in Jesus Christ, you are never ritually impure. And so what was happening here is, again, if Jesus, what the people of the circumcision party are saying is essentially, Jesus wasn't enough. You also have to do X, Y, and Z in order to be good, in a good standing with God. And so I guess just want to point that out. It's not about, hey, the moral laws of following God, honoring Him have not changed, but what makes us ritually pure? Well, Jesus is the once and for all perfect sacrifice. And so if you are in Jesus, you are ritually pure. Now, what this does not mean is that the law is bad or that following the Old Testament law is bad. If you have personal convictions, or if for you following certain, like for a lot of Jewish Christians today, Messianic Jews today, one of the ways that they honor God is by following the Old Testament law. Now, not because it saves them, but it's just a way to honor them. So even in the book of Acts and other places, Paul, for example, is not against the law. Jesus himself is not against the law. So that's not the problem. The problem is not the law. The problem is if we think doing X, Y, Z will save us rather than Jesus. So that's what's going on here. The circumcision party is essentially telling Christians, hey, Jesus wasn't enough. You also got to do X, Y, and Z. Now, we'll get a little bit more clarity in a couple of verses that give us more detail into some of the things that they were saying. But here, Paul is, if this is the case, Paul says that they must be silenced and not listened to, because again, they're kind of adding additional laws in order to be a true quote unquote Christian. And so for Paul, this is not a place, check this out, this is not a place for faithful Christians to disagree. What Paul is saying, these people, these deceivers are flat out wrong, and they need to be confronted as such. They are causing division, and it seems to be, again, from what we read in these verses, it seems to be motivated by financial gain somehow. Now, what could be happening is they could be asking or requiring certain offerings, or requiring people to pay for their teachings, which is a common practice in the ancient world. Hey, I've got these things I want to teach you about God or the gods, and if you pay me, I'll show you, or I'll show you the rituals or the sacrifices you have to do to get on God's good side. And so, again, it's essentially like, hey, Christians, pay us this money, and we'll show you the true things of God. So not only are they getting the gospel wrong, they're trying to profit off of it. So they're causing division by financial gain somehow. And then, so Paul's like, hey, rebuke them. And then in verse 12, Paul continues in Titus chapter 1, he says this. He says, one of their very own prophets said, Cretans are always liars, evil beasts, lazy gluttons. Verse 13, this testimony is true. For this reason, rebuke them sharply, so that they may be sound in the faith and may not pay attention to Jewish myths and the commands of people who reject the truth. So again, just want to point this out. When he says one of their own prophets, he's talking most likely about a local Cretan, what they say about themselves. In the ancient world, I do want to say this too, Crete was proverbial for its moral decadence. We have many surviving documents that speak to this, of like some of the bad stuff that happened there. So maybe a context for this is like, think of like Las Vegas in America. It's like, yeah, like a lot of not great stuff goes on there. In fact, Polybius writes this, an ancient document that he said that has been recovered. He says in response to the people of Crete, it is almost impossible to find personal conduct more treacherous or public policy more unjust than in Crete. Cicero, another ancient historian, says moral principles are so divergent that the Cretans consider highway robbery honorable. So, of course, sometimes people just don't like a certain area, so they write bad things about it. But this is more than your average, we just don't like that place stuff. Clearly, a lot of like not great stuff happens there. And so what Paul is doing here is he's referring to a quote that is widely attributed to, not to an actual prophet, but to a guy by the name of Epimenides. I don't know how to pronounce that name. But he was an ancient philosopher, and he wrote about how he wrote this about people in his own area. So the guy who lived in the island of Crete, and he was like, yeah, they're liars, evil beasts, lazy gluttons, like not great people. So the point here that Paul's trying to say is that the character of some of these false teachers is bad. So don't listen to them, but not only don't listen to them, actually rebuke them. Like, don't just ignore them. Actually verbally state to them and to others, hey, these people are wrong. So I just want to say, a healthy church then rebukes false teaching. A healthy church rebukes false teaching. And again, a healthy church is going to be made up of healthy Christians, which means this is also something that personal Christians do in our daily life, that we don't just ignore or just say, well, we just disagree, but we actually rebuke false teaching. So again, the teaching Paul gives here is not just to ignore, but to rebuke. Now, this goes against every grain of like our culture of like, don't say anything wrong if you disagree with someone, as long as they're quote unquote not hurting someone else. That's not scriptural guidance. Again, I also like to say this. This is why a biblical definition of love is so important, because according to God's word, correct rebuke is actually the loving thing to do. According to our cultural concept of love, rebuke is considered hate. So according to the scriptures, hey, man, if you got a friend who's in sin or making unwise decisions, not going the right direction, it is a loving thing to do to correct, rebuke, and to say something about it. According to our culture is, hey, let everyone do their own thing. Let everyone live their own truth. And if you were to say someone else is wrong, well, you're hateful. Again, we don't follow the world. We follow the scriptures. We follow Jesus. Now, here's the challenge. I do want to just hit this challenge. The challenge is correct rebuke in love with a proper motivation is what we should be doing. But so we should do that. Correct rebuke in love. Church leaders should do it. Jesus did it. Paul did it many times, like here. Titus will have to do it, as he's writing, and Timothy will have to do it when he writes the books of Timothy and Titus to these young pastors. Peter did it, James did it, John did it, the prophets did it, Priscilla and Aquila did it in the book of Acts. Like, that's what we do. We rebuke in love. Now, the challenge is, of course, you could do this as a jerk, but do it. But so we don't do that. But that doesn't mean we rebuke at all. So maybe give you an example. I don't just ignore my kids if they do or say something wrong. If my kids do something or say something wrong, Christina or I will rebuke them. And we are going to rebuke them because we love them. Now, yes, you can rebuke a child or a friend or a coworker or whatever, a family member, in an ungodly manner. Yes, you can do that. But you can also rebuke them in a godly one. And generally speaking, not always, but generally speaking, kids will misbehave, and they can misbehave a lot. And so what can happen is, if you are the question, like for us, like raising our kids, is like we want our kids to grow up into people that people want to be around. Our kids, and if you have kids yourself too, you know this, that there are certain friends that your kids have that you don't want your kids to be friends with because of how they behave, what they say, how they act. And the reason is, especially if you're a parent and you have kids and you're around other kids, and there are certain kids that you're like, man, I don't, these kids misbehave. I don't want to be around them. They're not good influences. The reason why these other kids are like that is because they haven't been properly rebuked in their lives. They have not been properly rebuked. Now, there's a lot of reasons for this, and it pretty much is never the kid's fault. Maybe they got a broken home, or parents that are very passive, a dad that's very absent, parents that are not consistent with their discipline. But the result is nonetheless, your child will regress if they spend more time with these kids that misbehave a lot. So the reason why you get misbehaved kids is because they haven't been properly rebuked. And as followers of Jesus, we want to do so in love. So again, a couple of things here. Paul here wants false teaching rebuked, not, by the way, check this out, not just because it is wrong, but because doctrinal error is accompanied by moral corruption. If you believe the wrong things, you will behave the wrong way. So I'm going to give you an example. Many mainline churches in America today that have abandoned theological orthodoxy and the historicity of the Gospels, they'll say things like, well, it's just good ideas to follow, or Jesus, this didn't actually happen, but here's the principle we can take from it. What happens not too far after is moral decay. So then you have a lot of mainline churches, denominations today that are affirming of things that the scriptures are not affirming of. They try to make muddy what scriptures are clear about. And so not only is their teaching wrong, but then their morality becomes wrong as well. Now, conversely, true is that true doctrine is accompanied by sound living. So this is what you see in Titus chapter 1, verses 5 through 9, where it talks about biblical elders. That biblical elders don't just have right practice, they have right living. Sorry, they don't just have right theology, they have right living and practice. Like, it's not just like, I know the Bible answers, but I'm loving, I'm kind, I hold grace and truth together, I pursue holiness in my life. Like, these things go together, right practice and right belief. Therefore, I just want to say, it is not unloving to say and to teach a biblical sexual ethic. It is not unloving to say and to teach that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life, and that all other religions and ideologies are false, and in some cases, many cases, could actually be described as demonic. Because this is how the scriptures talk about it, how Jesus talks about it, how Paul talks about it. To rebuke and to confront a friend living in sin or making unwise decisions is not unwise and unloving, and in fact, it could be unwise and unloving to avoid the subject altogether. Now, again, the way we can do it can be unloving, and so certainly we want to have wisdom and ask the Spirit to give us, clarity and gentleness as we confront these things. But these things are not unloving to do if done well. Rebuke is not unloving to do if done well, because healthy churches and healthy Christians rebuke false teaching. They don't just ignore it, they rebuke it. Last thing I want to say this too, I just want to reiterate in verse 14, Paul again says this. He says, not to pay attention to the commands of people who reject the truth. Can I just point this out? Christians should not take their guidance on what it looks like to follow Jesus and to live out their faith in the public square by people who do not know Jesus. Christians should not take their guidance from people, according to Paul, who do not pay attention to the commands of the people. He says, do not pay attention to the commands of people who reject the truth. If they reject Jesus, man, we don't take their wisdom on how to follow Jesus. Now, I'm not saying that there are not non-Christians who are very wise and very loving and have a lot of things that we should listen to. Absolutely. I'm not saying that. But what I am saying is that if somebody does not love Jesus, claims they don't love Jesus, does not know Jesus, claims they don't know Jesus, and is not trying to pursue Jesus, we should never take our cues on what it looks like to follow Jesus from someone who's not following Jesus. That just would not make sense. So, not to pay attention to people of the commands of people who reject the truth. Again, in the context of here, you're having non-Christians, people who are not honoring Jesus, telling Christians, here's how you actually are supposed to honor God. So, dear Christian, if you're a follower of Jesus, do not take your cues on what people on social media or your boss or the New York Times or TikTok say about, well, Christians, if you're a real Christian, you'll do this. If they're not following Jesus themselves, they don't love Jesus themselves, they actually really have no idea what that actually looks like. So, healthy churches, healthy Christians rebuke false teaching. We don't take our cues from culture of what it looks like to love and to follow Jesus, and we make it important. We make a priority in our life to follow Jesus ourselves. Now we're going to move to our cultural analysis. This was really interesting. I want to just shed some thoughts on a study I saw and read recently. This was a study done by the National Survey of Children's Health. I guess it is NSCH for short. This was a large federally funded survey conducted by the U.S. Health Resources and Services Administration, and it has to do with fathers and the impact that fathers and the influence that fathers have on their kids' grades in school. So, this was the academic outcomes by family structure. Again, this was a study in Virginia by the NSCH in 2022 and 2023. So here's what they found in the study. Now, this study, I can't show you this graphic because it's obviously a podcast, so I'm going to explain to you this graphic and some takeaways. This was a study done for grades for boys and girls in school, and it looked at the average grades for boys with an intact family versus a father absent family, and it does the same thing for girls. So it looked at the average grade for girls that have an intact family, and then what the average age for grades for girls are who have an absent father. Now, just to be clear on terms, an intact family is a child who lives with both biological or adoptive parents who are married to each other and are present in the same household. So an intact family is a married mom and a dad, either biologically or adoptive, but they're married and they live together and they're both present in the household. That is an intact family. So again, it's the grades of what happens when dad and mom, particularly when dad is present and they're married, and what happens when dad is absent and not married. And basically how it breaks down is it breaks it down into four categories in terms of grades. It has those who make mostly A's, those who make mostly A's and B's, those who make mostly B's and C's, and those who make mostly C's and lower. And I'm going to break it down this way. So just try to make this, so you can track with me. Either you can break it down into high performing and low performing. So high performing are kids that make mostly A's or mostly A's and B's. So that's high performing, A's and B's. And low performing is mostly B's and C's or C's and lower. So basically, if they're making mostly A's or mostly A's and B's, that's high performing. And if they're making mostly B's and C's or lower, that is low performing. Now, here's the data for the boys and for the girls. So for intact families, so when mom and dad are present and dad is in the household, high performing, again, mostly A's or mostly A's and B's, 84% of the boys in this study in Virginia were high performing if mom and dad were married and dad was present. 84%, staggering. Low performing, again, so this is boys who are part of intact families. Low performing, which is B's and C's, or mainly B's and C's or lower, 16%. So 16% of boys who live in an intact family are low performing in school. 84% of boys who live in an intact family are high performing in school. That's crazy. A father absent. So these are not father absent. So not intact families, and the dad wasn't very present in the kids' lives. The high performing boys, only 50%. So instead of 84% are mostly A's and B's, it goes down to 50%. And the lower performing, which is mostly B's and C's or lower, goes from 16% up to 50%. That is a drastic shift. So if dad is not present, high performance goes from 84% to 50%. Low performance goes from 16% to 50%. In other words, here's how I can break the data down for you. Boys without a father at home were 3 times more likely to fall into the lower performing category compared to boys from intact families. If they don't have a dad at home, 3 times more likely. Oh my gosh. So I want to point this out so bad. Extracurricular activities, tutors, sports, all the things at private school. I'm not saying these things are wrong. The biggest difference in a child's life is whether or not mom and dad are married. So 3 times more likely to fall into the low performing category if they're not an intact family. And girls, pretty much the same thing. So girls from intact families, they're high performing, so mostly A's and B's. 90% of girls in this study from intact families, and only 10% of girls, again, predominantly B's and C's or C's and lower, only 10% of girls in intact families, that was their grades. Now, just so you know, in general, especially in grade school, girls get higher grades than boys. A lot of things are contributed to that. Some of the fact is that we have not enough male teachers. Some of that is just how learning works, and boys are a lot more physical and active. And so school, generally speaking, is a little bit more difficult for boys, but still 90% high performing for girls, 10% low performing for girls in intact families. If the father is absent, higher performing girls are at 62%. So still a big drop. Not as much as the boys, but still a big drop. And then the lower performing girls go from 10% to 38%. So 38% of girls in non-intact father absent homes perform poorly at school, or low performing at school. In other words, here's the data on this. Girls in father absent homes were nearly 4 times more likely to struggle academically compared to girls in intact families. So boys and girls are both between 3 and 4 times more likely to struggle if dad is not present. So I just want to point this out. The contrast here is huge. Among boys in intact families, 84% are doing well academically, getting mostly A's or A's and B's, compared to just 50% of boys without a father at home. For girls, the gap is even more pronounced, at least statistically, because 90% of girls from mom and dad households are top performers versus just 62% in father absent homes. This means that father absent boys and girls are about 3 to 4 times, again, more likely to be in the lower performing category if dad's not around. This data doesn't mean kids without fathers can't succeed, but it shows how much of a head start an intact family structure can give. Now, I always sometimes, especially as a pastor, this is hard for me to talk about, because when I point out stuff like this, I know some of the audience, some of the people listening to this are single parents, or maybe they came from a single parent household. And so I always want to be clear, this is not to shame or guilt anybody if this is your situation. And the good news is kids are really super resilient. Now, there's a lot of data that I'm not going to get into it here that shows that belonging to something like a church really does impact this stuff in your situation. So if you're single parent, I should say, man, get your kids in community with other adults, and it will radically change some of these outcomes. So that said, I do want to point out that here's what's hard, because I know there's a lot of people outside of their choice that are in situations like this. However, I do want to point out the truth about this stuff so that people can understand how important it actually is. That so much of our society depends on healthy families. So again, I just want to say this. Sometimes you'll hear, especially the last 15 years with gay marriage and all these things changing, the refrain was, who cares who gets married with who or who sleeps with who behind closed doors? And I just want to say something that doesn't sound maybe culturally nice, but it's just true. To support gay marriage matters because it impacts culture. Who you sleep with impacts culture, especially because here's what's going on now, especially things like surrogacy and the like that are happening today, where we are intentionally creating children and treating children like a commodity for the intent of placing a kid in a disadvantaged home. So you have two men who are married together and they'll have a surrogate pregnancy and they're intentionally creating life so a child to be taken from a mom and given to two dads, or taken, from a surrogate mom and to give it to two moms. And when you do that, no matter how politically incorrect this sounds, you are putting your kids at a disadvantage because kids need a mom and a dad to thrive. That's what they need. And so we treat kids like commodity because who you sleep with is impacting all this stuff. Again, this is not very politically correct to say this stuff, but I just want to point this out that data does not care about your feelings or my feelings. It does not care about how, quote unquote, unloving it sounds to say, hey, kids should not be intentionally put in homes with two moms and two dads. It doesn't matter how loving that sounds. That's what the data says. Kids need a mom. Kids need a dad. And then therefore, we should promote any policy that supports those things we should support. And policies that go against that, we should not support them. We should not support them. Dads matter. Moms matter. But dads, be present in your kids' lives. Love them. They need more than that. They need more than tutors, extracurriculars, or private school or sports. Kids need a dad. They need a dad. And that's what this data overwhelmingly and unequivocally shows us. Moving into the last portion of the show today, The Sin of Empathy by Joe Rigney. Now I'm going to give you some review of the book and then some takeaways I had from it. This book explores what empathy actually is, how it's commonly misunderstood, and why, when misapplied, it can actually be harmful, that empathy can actually be a really bad thing. The author explains how empathy differs from compassion, using the analogy of someone drowning in a river. So here's one of the analogies you can give, that if you see someone jumping or drowning in a river, if you jump in and simply feel what they feel and affirm what they affirm and just grieve with them, and that's all you do, you both get swept away. So someone's drowning and you just jump in with them, you're going to get swept away. Compassion instead, which he talks about, compassion and sympathy, means anchoring yourself and helping them out of the water. So we should be present and supportive, but not necessarily affirming everything they feel. So we should, find a tree, rope ourselves to the tree, then get into the water, get in there with them, but then help drag them out. Now, I will say, while the title feels unnecessarily provocative, and I would say, to my opinion, the tone is brash at times, the author, surprisingly, with that, is actually very caring. In fact, one of the strengths of the book is how deeply he acknowledges trauma, pain, and the reality of hard experiences. So he's not just like dismissing some of the things that people go through when he says, hey, we shouldn't be unhelpfully empathetic here, but we should still acknowledge, even if somebody's, acting unhealthy, that they went through some really hard stuff. Even when calling out emotional and manipulation, he does so with pastoral sensitivity, showing that being rooted in truth doesn't mean we're cold or indifferent. We need to grieve with people, be compassionate, and offer hope, but not at the expense of truth. I found the book to be especially helpful for pastors. It gives language and clarity to some of the emotional dynamics of our current cultural moment, and it offers a necessary counterbalance to the idea that love means full affirmation. While I didn't agree with every word choice or tone, and at times it felt a bit too strong in my opinion, I'm glad to have read it. I give it a 7.5 out of 10. Again, for my ratings, if it's an 8 or higher, that means I do recommend the book for pretty much everybody. 7.5. The reason I didn't quite get an 8 is just because of the tone. It's interesting. I still actually do really recommend this book for pretty much everybody, especially if you're a leader. But the tone, the brashness took it down a little bit for me. Now, a couple of things I took away from the book. Emotional manipulation is a huge thing in our culture today, and so the book rightly points this out. Emotional manipulation is a huge thing that makes us cowards and afraid to do the right thing, and it should be pointed out. This book does a really good job putting language to perhaps some of the stuff that you felt but not sure how to describe, so I think the book is really good there. I will say again, the title of the book is provocative on purpose, which I don't love, because empathy, depending on how you define it, is not inherently sinful. So to say the sin of empathy is kind of implying that like all empathy is simple, not necessarily. Now, the book does a good job showing how there really isn't a standard definition of empathy. In the book, he gives a definition in the book, and then he explains what he means by the title. And in which case, yeah, based on his definition of it, I see where he's coming from. But in the title itself, you don't get that explanation. And so I think it's like, not super clear in what he means, and it kind of saying like empathy is inherently sinful no matter what. And again, depending on how you define it, I wouldn't say it's inherently sinful. So again, that was a knock for me. The tension I got while reading this book is that the speaking the truth is good. I mean, that's what I've been doing on the show today. Speaking the truth is good. And just because someone may not want to hear what you have to say, it doesn't make it wrong to say it. And sometimes it is the most loving thing to do is simply to speak the truth plainly and not to sugarcoat it. Still, at times, it did feel a little strong for me, and that's, again, why I didn't quite get the 8 or higher rating. But it's a tension in my life, too. Personally, as I meet with people as a pastor, yeah, you want to be pastoral and loving and gracious, but there are times where you just need to say the thing. And I would say, Rigney here feels obviously personally that saying that he is just probably, he would say, I am just saying the thing. So I'll say that. That said, I would recommend the book overall, as it challenges some common cultural assumptions we might not even be aware that we have. Nice thing about the book, too, is it's like 180, 90 pages, so it's not a long read either. And so there's not a lot of fluff there, which I always enjoy. And of course, he does, one of the things when I rate books and read books is the book actually what the title is about? And in this book, it actually is. So give it a 7.5 out of 10, some reservations about it. But even though I have some reservations about it, I just think it is really helpful in confronting some of the cultural lies that we believe in. So I would recommend the book. And again, that is The Sin of Empathy by Joe Rigney. So again, thanks so much for joining me on this episode of The Intentional Life. Love for you to subscribe to the show if you haven't, share it with some friends, and I'll be back with you next time for another episode of The Intentional Life.